From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Monday, September 4th. Last week, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese finally announced that the referendum on the voice to Parliament will be held on October 14th. This may feel somewhat anticlimactic. After all, it feels as if we've been surrounded by a non-stop news cycle and debate about this proposed amendment to the Constitution for over a year. But now we are less than 6 weeks out until the referendum, and there still seems to be a lot that we don't know about the way people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, feel that the voice will impact them. This is what one of our journalists discovered during a recent trip to 3 towns in regional New South Wales. In 1965, these towns were pivotal stops on the so-called Freedom Ride, a tour that exposed the segregationist policies of the time. Today, federal political reporter Lisa Visentin on what she learned about Australia while revisiting the Freedom Ride and what people on both sides of the debate have told her. So, Lisa, you recently travelled through 3 towns in rural New South Wales. They were key stops on the so-called Freedom Ride, which took place in 1965. So can you tell us about the Freedom Ride and why you decided to go on this trip and revisit it?
So the Freedom Ride was a 15-day journey in February 1965, organised by a group of University of Sydney students. And you're right, it went through a range of towns in regional New South Wales, but we went to just 3 key towns along that journey, and they were Walgett, Moree and Bowraville. The Freedom Ride famously was led by a young activist at the time in Charlie Perkins.
A lot of Australians talk about, oh yes, we want to give the Aborigine a fair go, then it's full stop and it's usually forgotten. They never go on to say, look.
The Freedom Ride back then, it was modelled on the US Freedom Rides where university students were going out and Black activists were going out and trying to expose blatant segregation in southern US towns.
In 1965, Charles Perkins and other young students made the first of the anti-segregationist freedom rides through country towns. Blacks couldn't vote.
And the purpose of the Charlie Perkins-led Freedom Ride in Australia was to sort of say, well, hey, this happens in Australia as well, and this, in fact, is happening in regional New South Wales.
Blacks couldn't vote, couldn't marry without permission, couldn't use white pubs or clubs or swimming pools without permission. The Freedom Ride
wouldn't be allowed to work in the shops because they're not tidy enough. There's a lot of them here that's got good jobs in the cafes and that, and they just won't hold them.
In Walgett, for example, there was a colour bar that wouldn't even allow Aboriginal ex-servicemen to go into the pub to be served, with maybe a small exception on Anzac Day.
The Freedom Riders were to face resentment, threats and sometimes violence.
When we left Walgett and the bus got run off the road after that chase by the hoodlums, that was very, very scary, and having to go back into Walgett to see the police.
So there was clearly systemic, blatant sort of segregation in these towns, and the 1965 Freedom Ride really put a national and sort of garnered international attention as well. And the change that sort of paved the way really put a spotlight on what needed to change in the lead up to the 1967 referendum, because the 1967 referendum in part was about giving the Commonwealth government the power to make laws for Aboriginal people.
Let us support Aboriginal organisation. Let us vote in favour of any legislation which allows for the elevation of the Aboriginal people. They don't do these things. They talk about it, but they never do it.
And so our purpose was to go back and speak to people who could remember that period, who could remember the Charlie Perkins bus rolling into town, and to see what they were thinking now about the voice and putting the voice on a historical timeline of that's what it was like in the 60s. There's been a lot of advancements since then. We're being told by Yes advocates that there's a thread from perhaps 1965 and the Freedom Ride to the 1967 referendum, and that this referendum is the unfinished business of 1967. And so it was really to ask people what they thought about that, if they had some sort of historical connection to the Freedom Ride, if they could remember it, and then also just to get the vibe of people on the ground, just everyday people, Aboriginal people living in those communities, what they're thinking about it, what the debate is like there, and also to speak to non-Indigenous people as well.
And you spoke to one elder, Mary Peirce. Can you tell me about her story?
Yeah, so Mary Peirce was 10 years old. Her name was Mary Hall at the time when the Freedom Ride rolled into Walgett in February 1965.
Right, just start with your name and your nation.
My name's Mary Jean Peirce, nee Hall, and I'm a Gamilaroi.
Her dad was a leading sort of Aboriginal community figure, Harry Hall, and she can remember the protest outside Walgett RSL where Charlie Perkins and the university students picketed alongside members of the local Aboriginal community to protest the fact that Aboriginal people couldn't be served in the pub. They weren't allowed in.
Well, all the town, they heard this bus was coming to town and Charlie Perkins. Then we found out, they were there to demonstrate, and a lot of people were around, and it was just lovely to see the students, fighting for Aboriginal rights in Walgett.
So Mary had this really heart-wrenching story about living in Walgett as a young child, and there was a shop in the town called Sheehan's Dress Shop, and the Aboriginal women were not allowed to try on dresses there.
There was a lot of racism around in those days, It was horrible. And
because the view by the shopkeeper was if they were to try it on and then it didn't fit, the white women would not want to try on a dress that a black woman had tried on. So their only option really was if they wanted to purchase from that shop, they had to buy it and hope that it fit.
Going to school and everything too, my school days and that, I found some there, racism and everything.
And she remembers that after the Freedom Ride, that colour bar there eventually disappeared. I suppose the shop owner was forced to abandon that practice, essentially.
And it was really exciting for me because I was actually allowed to go in and try the dress on and purchase it, where before I'd just have to go in and pick it up and walk out, whether it fit me or not. And that was the big change there. And, that dress, like I said, 46 years old, and I've still got it.
Yeah.
Hey.
46 years in her closet, and just held on as this sort of symbol of this post-segregationist era that the Freedom Rides ushered into Walgett.
And because of that clear link between 1965 and the Freedom Ride and all the activism by your dad and others to just get a better deal, how are you feeling now in your mind about the voice to Parliament and having to vote on this in a few months from now?
Well, at this stage, I'm in two minds at the moment about it.
Yeah.
About the voice. I sort of look back on things, and the referendum didn't change anything, I feel.
And yet Mary is still yet to be convinced that the voice is really the best way forward. And I think one of the purposes of this trip was really to find voices like hers and to see what they're thinking and whether the voice is seen as a solution to the challenges that they have out there.
Can you tell us a little bit about Mary Peirce's ambivalence about the voice?
Well, she was really reluctant to talk about it. And I think that in and of itself was interesting.
Sort of mixed, or
it's mixed, yeah, it's a mixed view.
And do you think that's because people need more information, or they're just uncertain, or?
They're just uncertain, I think, because we've had all the information we can get, but people just not ready to say yes or no yet here, I feel. Some are for it, I must say. Yeah.
Her ambivalence, I guess, points to the fact that the Yes campaign has struggled to reach people like her. There's an ongoing problem with the lack of detail around the voice, and there seems to be, and this was beyond Mary, other people who told us sort of directly that they were reluctant to back in an idea where they weren't sure, they weren't given any guarantee that their community was actually going to be on the voice or be represented in some way or have a hearing from the voice.
Which brings me to another woman that you spoke to who I was very struck by, Gamilaroi woman Jennifer Trindle in Walgett. And she was quite expressive, I think, about why she was opposing the voice to Parliament. So what did she say?
So she said she'd always been sort of leaning no.
Look, it's a no for me because I haven't got any definitive answers to a lot of my questions. It's still very fluffy. There's nothing definite or set in stone. There is no time frames.
And was convinced of her no position because she couldn't get any guarantee that her community would be represented on The Voice. That just really speaks to the challenge that the Yes camp have when they can't outline at this stage, on this side of the referendum, how many people will be on The Voice, how they're going to be chosen, who's going to get a say in that, and whether somewhere like Walgett will have a representation on The Voice, or whether, maybe that person will come from Moree or from somewhere else. I mean, I would just say on the ground in Walgett and Moree in particular, we saw a lot more of a mixed perspective, a real range of views from everyone from a Mary Purse on the fence to just outright no's to people who were firmly in the Yes camp. So Aboriginal politics, as I've found, is a very, very complicated space. There are a lot of sort of competing nations and tribes and clans, and even within those groups, a lot of jostling for who should be the spokesperson for whom. And I think, if the referendum is successful, that is going to be a huge challenge for legislators to confront.
Something that I think's been really lost in the often very heated debate over the last year or so, which is that it is non-Indigenous people in Australia who will decide the fate of whether we get this voice to Parliament. Non-Indigenous people represent 97% of the population. So what do you make of this after spending the week speaking to people in rural New South Wales?
I think so many Australians don't know Indigenous people. They don't have an Indigenous relative or an Indigenous friend. And this is something that the Yes side have grappled with. There's lots of comparisons made to the same-sex marriage campaign and how the case for Yes in that instance was able to tap into this idea that most people know someone who is gay or have an uncle or an auntie who is gay. So we're able to make that intimate connection. Whereas with this referendum, so much of the country does not know or have Aboriginal friends or have Aboriginal family members. And so therefore it's not a front of mind issue, and you're asking people to contemplate a change that is probably not going to affect them directly on a day-to-day sort of granular level or affect their family on a day-to-day granular level. It was a particularly sore point for a number of the Aboriginal leaders that we spoke to. And so I think there is this, level of dismay, I suppose, among some people that this campaign is being fought on their behalf, but ultimately it's going to be predominantly white Australia, or, more correctly, non-Indigenous Australia that decides this outcome.
And Lisa, I wanted to ask you about, the contrast between this upcoming referendum on The Voice and the 1967 referendum. At that time, in 1967, 90% of Australians voted in favour of that change. And in contrast, the latest polls from the middle of August, in terms of the latest referendum, show that less than 50% of Australians support the currently proposed changes to the Constitution. So what do you make of this? Do you think this points to a significant cultural change here, or something else?
I mean, two very different propositions are on the table. In 1967, you had a campaign that had the backing of both sides of politics. It was bipartisan. There was no official no case at the time. There was just a yes case, and it was doing something that was seen as, I suppose, fairly uncontroversial and straightforward for the time. It was in the midst of this sort of civil rights movement, and the Freedom Ride helped, as I said, shine that spotlight on some of the injustices that many Australians didn't even know were happening in regional towns. Just those blatant policies of segregation that were occurring at theatres and cafes and pubs and clubs. That shocked many people. Whereas this time round, there is a formal no campaign, there isn't bipartisanship at a federal level, and there is a debate over whether or not The Voice can actually achieve practical change, particularly when we don't know the ins and outs of how it is going to work. So I think it's a much more live debate and a much more fertile ground to have that debate, even though underpinning this, everyone is broadly on board with the idea that the status quo for Aboriginal people cannot stay the same. It's just whether or not The Voice is the right avenue for achieving that change. That's where the debate lies.
And finally, Lisa, I wanted to ask you, Did you come away from your trip with any sort of insight as to what the impact will be to Australia and Australians if this voice to Parliament does get up, or alternatively, if it doesn't?
Well, I think there's going to be some very heavy-hearted people on the other side of this if it does fail, and the polls suggest at the moment that that's the direction that it's heading in. There's a challenge that is going to confront, firstly, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, but also Peter Dutton. If this does fail, there will be a reckoning about what next, because there is this agreement that things can't continue as they are with the gap so wide and at no point looking like it's going to close anytime soon. I think there's a reckoning to be had there about, well, what now? Now that we've taken the whole country to a vote, what do we do next? We sort of can't let this momentum or this broad agreement that things need to change just to sort of be put on the back burner. And then conversely, if it does get up, I think there's a huge challenge confronting the Albanese government in delivering a model that has the buy-in from Indigenous people and to making sure that they put in place a framework that looks like it has a shot at delivering on some of the lofty ambitions that it's imposed upon it. This idea that it will make a practical difference, that it will be focused on securing change in those 4 key areas of health, education, employment outcomes. And so that's going to be an enormous, enormous task on the other side of this if it is successful.
Well, Lisa, we're lucky that you took this week to travel to these towns and speak to people on the ground. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.